Resist the corporate media narrative. Support independent activist news. Go to patreon.com/actout to become a patron of Act Out. This week, the climate fight in the Devil's Den clashes with free speech, and in a new category, New Old News, we dive into a more than 200-year-old fight for voting rights in the last continental colony in the U.S. And yes, even if that's not where you live, it matters. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Before we dive into today's special episode, I want to take a few minutes to go back to late last week and give you some insight into the climate fight here in the Devil's Den and the interesting lack of First Amendment rights in the home of our federal government. Take a look. So we are out here outside the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where they just held their monthly meeting, where the commissioners of FERC sit around and congratulate each other on making a shit ton of profit over the destruction of people and planet. FERC has a long history, we've talked about it on the show, of rubber stamping dirty oil and gas projects, among them the Spectra AIM pipeline, which is still being fought at this moment. Dakota Access Pipeline is another example of the type of projects that FERC likes to rubber stamp. So, we came to the meeting today. I had planned to disrupt, and Chris had planned to film. And the way it works is that if you have disrupted before, you are escorted to an overflow room so that you are silenced. If you haven't disrupted before, you are supposedly allowed to go to this public meeting because it is listed as a public meeting. However, myself and Chris, who you don't see because he's behind the camera, were escorted into the overflow room even though we have attended and filmed but not disrupted. So essentially this amounts to being silenced before we had a chance to speak. So in this federal building, the First Amendment does not apply. And you're going to see two videos right now of people who did disrupt, Gabe and Judith, and they were allowed in the room, maybe because they looked better than I do. But you'll hear their stories and why they chose to disrupt. And if you would like to come to DC and disrupt, the FERC meetings are once a month on a Thursday, and you can find more information about that at Beyond Extreme Energy.
I have an order from New York. We are demanding that you issue a stop work permit on the Spectra AIM pipeline immediately. You have ignored requests from elected officials all across New York. You are not doing your job. This is not democracy. It's a hilarious game y'all are playing. Wow. It's wonderful. It's really great. You're profiting off the destruction of my future on this planet. I don't know how you sleep at night. Damn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stop Spectra. Stop AIM. Stop Spectra. Stop AIM.
My name is Gabriel Shapiro. I'm standing here at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, D.C. So today I took action to disrupt the monthly commissioner meeting here at FERC, specifically with a message from New York regarding the Spectra AIM pipeline. Right now, Spectra is building a massive frac gas pipeline set to run within yards of the Indian Point nuclear plant and underneath the Hudson River. There's been direct actions with people inside the pipe blocking it. The people of New York do not accept this pipeline. None of the well-being of the residents near the pipeline, the planet, and the wildlife near the pipeline has been considered by FERC. FERC continuously rubber stamps approval of projects such as Spectra AIM pipeline and dozens more. So I took a stand today to make a strong statement to FERC, to everyone within FERC. Each individual in this building is complacent in this agency, continuing to allow this industry to destroy my future on this planet, and I wanted each individual to know that it's up to them to make a moral decision, because we're not living in times when we can continue to shrug our shoulders and say that it's just my job and I'm getting paid to do this. There's no more time for people to be hiding behind these walls. It's time for us to come forth and to make decisions that are going to protect the future of the children who are going to inhabit this planet.
Hi, I'm Judith Kelly. I just disrupted the FERC meeting this morning. I am representing my family in northeastern Pennsylvania who have a farm that's surrounded by gas wells, and the noise pollution is their number one complaint. So I brought my brother with me, about my mother, 5-year anniversary of her death today. All of us really concerned about the water and the danger, the risk of fracking surrounding our property. I have a short statement that I'd like to read. In rural Susquehanna County in northeastern Pennsylvania, fracking is widespread. This risky, greed-based practice causes great harm to people and the environment. My brother lives alone on the family farm near Gibson. He did not sign any gas lease, but he suffers the stress of continuing noise pollution surrounded by gas wells miles away. That noise continues constantly, all day and all night. He hears this while he's inside his house, intensely aware of this unwanted disturbance. Giant water trucks travel at high speeds on the narrow country roads, adding more noise, air pollution, and danger to the overworked drivers themselves and to anyone who has to travel those roads. Whatever peaceful country life people have enjoyed is gone. My brother has had heart bypass surgery, no doubt linked to the stress of living in his own home, but surrounded by endless noise, high volume traffic, and the constant risk to his water supply, his source of income, and his peace of mind.
Now, as I mentioned, you can find more information about FERC and how to oppose their twisted ties to big oil and gas by visiting beyondextremeenergy.org. Now, moving on, it's easy to lose sight of news stories in the heat of this ongoing insult to our intelligence known as the presidential election. It makes it even more difficult when you consider that this news is really a more than 200-year-old story that people either don't think about or don't know to think about. The last remaining continental colony is this week's new old news story. Yes, despite the fact that history books say that the last continental colony became a state way back in 1790 when Rhode Island ratified the Constitution, it turns out that another colony was created that very same year. And for the past 226 years, the District of Columbia has been vying for basic voting rights. Our upcoming guest will dive deeper, but here's the basic gist. We have no representation. Our Rep. Eleanor Holmes Norton is a non-voting member of the House who can at best lobby her colleagues without the added bonus that most lobbyists bring to the table, like five-star hotel stays, strippers, and cocaine. And in case you're wondering, we have absolutely no representation in the Senate. And until 1964, D.C. residents were not allowed to vote for president. It literally took a constitutional amendment to give us that right. And until 73, city officials were still appointed by the federal government. In other words, in 2016, more than 650,000 people living right next door to the fucking Congress have absolutely no say in what goes on there. D.C. resident and statehood activist Ann Lyko has more on the last continental colony and why it matters for you. Take a look.
Well, the District of Columbia is a creature of the Constitutional Convention, and it was created in the Constitution that there was to be a district not exceeding 10 square miles would be the seat of government of the United States. And George Washington was the one who helped pick out the site at the confluence of the Potomac and the Anacostia rivers. When the capital was actually moved here in effectively January 1st, 1801. We, as a result, compared to all the colonies, including the 37 states who were added after the original 13 colonies, we're the only ones where the people who lived here in what is now the District of Columbia were part of the original 13 colonies, fought in the Revolution, right, were part of the United States, and then lost their rights starting in 1801. The reason goes back to all those great compromises that were made to pass the Constitution, and to that big stain on America's history, which is slavery and race. After the war, the radical Republican Congress during Reconstruction created a territory of the District of Columbia, which most people don't know. So from 1871 to 1874, we were a territory with a presidentially appointed governor, a bicameral legislature, the upper house appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, the lower house popularly elected. We had about 35% or more black population in the district at the time. When Reconstruction was beginning to end and the southern states were being readmitted to the Union and the old Confederates were being pardoned and running for office and getting elected to Congress and going sitting up on Capitol Hill, looking down at their capital city and seeing this vibrant city that was being rebuilt and that had a thriving, mixed, diverse population where the minority citizens actually had representation and were actively participating in the government, they said, I don't think we like this. And in 1874, the territorial government was abolished. And at that point, Congress appointed 3 commissioners who ruled, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, who ruled the District of Columbia for almost a century. And we had absolutely no rights. And it was during that time that you had Jim Crow laws coming in the South. The whole time, starting from 1801 forward, the people of the District of Columbia were petitioning, protesting to ask for their rights. And in the 20th century, the sort of first major changes came with the passage of the 23rd Amendment in 1961, and the first, when it was finally ratified, which allowed the District of Columbia to have a vote for president with the same number of electoral votes as the least populous state in the United States. When we voted in 1964 for the first time since 1800, when we helped elect Thomas Jefferson, we had 3 electoral votes. Our population was around 800,000 at that point. And the net result was that everybody who voted in that election in the District of Columbia had the weight of 3/4 of a vote of somebody in the states, because we should have had 2 congressmen at the ratios that existed in 1964. The next major change was the passage of the Home Rule Act in December of 1973 under Richard Nixon. And that had the fact that it got passed had a lot to do with, one, the civil rights movement. And civil rights activists coming here, and including Martin Luther King, who understood that the district was in a different category than the South or the rest of the places in the United States where African Americans lived, in that in the rest of the United States, the U.S. Constitution, their state constitutions gave everybody equal rights, the right to vote, the right to participate in their government and to govern themselves. And the problem was either state laws or customs or just plain harassment or terrorism that were preventing people from exercising those rights, the sort of voter intimidation. In the District of Columbia, he recognized we didn't even have the right to self-government, from which the right to vote is the way you exercise it. And as a result, Martin Luther King came to the District of Columbia many times to speak and march with the residents of the District of Columbia for home rule and other rights for D.C., and actually lobbied Congress and LBJ to push for that to happen. So it took Richard Nixon and until 1973 to push it through. So this was after Martin Luther King's assassination, after all the riots in the cities across the country. And Nixon really wanted to keep the lid on things in the Capitol. And he thought one way to do that was to toss something to the people and give them a little sop so that they could have what is in reality a temporary delegation of authority from Congress to elect a mayor and a council. But all the laws that they pass or anything they do can be overturned, nullified, changed by Congress at any time, for any reason or no reason at all, because under Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 17, Congress has exclusive legislation over the seat of government, which is the District of Columbia.
So with this in mind about DC not being a state, it still has to do some of the things that states have to do, like pay taxes. And if you've ever driven around DC, you'll see these around the license plate. It says taxation without representation. Talk a little bit about the fact that we still are expected to act like a state in that sense, but not have the other rights of a state.
So we have generally had the same responsibilities as states. And the problem is we don't have the final authority on this, on what we do, because Congress can always overturn us. Our budget is treated not as our budget that we approve and therefore we can spend. We're treated as if we were an agency of the federal government. Therefore, our budget is contained in the budget of the United States that goes through the president and OMB and gets sent up to Congress. And the thing to understand all of this is because of that provision in the Constitution, Congress is our unelected state legislature as well as our unelected federal legislature. So there's no separation of powers in terms of federal and state. Congress has the authority total authority over our budget. And so what they often do is add a rider that prohibits us or requires us to do something. And the prohibitions have included prohibiting us from doing needle exchange when the HIV/AIDS epidemic started, which led to the District of Columbia having the highest infection rate in the nation that was equivalent to Southern Africa, and it was at what the Centers for Disease Control called it epidemic levels. It's been brought down significantly since then because that rider was removed. We've been prohibited from using our locally raised funds to do reproductive health services and abortions for poor district women. We were prohibited under a rider that Bob Barr from Georgia put in on our budgets kind of at the last minute to even count the ballots on an initiative that we had for medical marijuana back in the 1990s. And we actually, probably the only time in history that the Congress of the United States has prohibited Americans from counting the ballots in an election, because they prohibited us from spending any money on this initiative. And since the ballots had already been printed, because it was only several weeks before the election, people voted, but the Board of Elections could count everything else but that item until we went to the U.S. District Court and got a ruling, which took a while, to be able to count the ballots, and found out that it had passed overwhelmingly, but we couldn't implement it because Congress would prohibit us from implementing it, and then that took another 14 years, I think, before we could actually implement it.
So what are the reasons given? I mean, besides the fact that it's perhaps more convenient to have a colony than a state that's autonomous, what are the reasons that are given as to why DC shouldn't become a state?
Well, it's now it started out saying, well, the founding fathers never wanted us to do this, or they wouldn't have written the Constitution this way. Well, the problem is, if you understand the history, the Constitution was written this way because it was a compromise, and they were expected to fix it.
Right.
And then it became just, well, this is the way it is, and if I have a pet issue that I want to appeal to a special interest group back at home, and there's something that they want, but we don't have either the political ability or the legal right to impose that restriction or whatever it is on Americans generally. We can do anything to the people of the District of Columbia.
So then why a state? I mean, obviously it seems that it's necessary, but are there any other pathways that could be used to give DC the same rights as a state, or does it have to be creation of a state?
If you read the Constitution, and this is the handy-dandy pocket one that Congress puts out, the Constitution was written by a convention of delegates elected as representatives of the state. The essential, we the people of the United States, the essential element of sovereignty is we created the state. So it was the people of the 13 colonies who said, we are free human beings, have the right to self-government, and we're going to create our own governments, and they created the state governments. And so when they formed a union, that's why we're the United States with an S, it was a union of these sovereign states. So if you're not a state, you go through the Constitution and you can see section after section after section that it's all written in terms of what the states may do, or the states are prohibited from doing or what the federal government from doing. And if you're not in that category, you're not there.
Right.
And when you ask about other things, any other thing that's been tried, whether it was trying to get a vote for a non-voting delegate, whether it was trying to get Congress to pass a law to say our budget didn't have to go through Congress. I mean, all of this stuff Congress could take away. None of it's permanent. The only thing Congress cannot rescind is the grant of statehood and admission of a state to the Union. Every other law they can repeal or change or do something. The other problem is if you're depending upon Congress passing a series of laws saying, well, we'll treat you the same as a state for all these purposes, you're always less than everybody else. You're always playing catch up. And what I would say is sort of an analogy and why it was so important, the whole issue of marriage equality for LGBTQ people, is because it's a status. And being a citizen of a state is a legal status. And once you have that, you have all the rights that go with it. No matter how they change, whether it's by court decision or by law or whatever, you don't have to go back and ask for them again.
Right.
And once you're married, you have all the rights of a married person, no matter what the law is. Otherwise, you're always less. And to put it sort of more bluntly, the only way you can be free is to be 100% free. Anything less than that, you're not. And we're not.
To find out more about the initiative that Anne and many other residents are working on, check out dcstatehoodyeswecan.org. Now, if you live in an actual state, you know that statehood is certainly not the only answer to all of your problems. But consider this fucked fact. In D.C., nearly 1 in 5 residents and 1 in 3 children is currently living in poverty, higher than each of the 50 states. Meanwhile, billionaire lobbyists and members of Congress sashay through the newly gentrified and cocooned areas of D.C., taking over buildings like the Central Union Mission, a former homeless shelter whose current bottom-floor resident sells bicycles for $3,000 and vintage American flags for $15,000. That's the cheap one. Little side note on corporate journalism here. As this was going down, the only thing that the Washington Post had to say about it was quite literally, somehow it works. No, it doesn't, you fucking bought and paid for pieces of shit. It doesn't work for anybody but the dipshit rich bitches who go to live there and buy useless crap that could literally pay for a kid's food for an entire fucking year. Gentrification does not equal revitalization. Interestingly enough, in the same year that the mission was getting taken over by twats selling pieces of fabric for more than a used car, journalist Daniel Weeks published a series on poverty versus democracy in America for The Atlantic, where he speaks to, among others, homeless DC native Malik about democracy, poverty, and voting. Like many homeless people, Malik is not only educated but understands the political and personal reasons for poverty and homelessness. As a territory with no control over its own tax revenue, it's not surprising that the majority of DC's money goes to gentrify and buff up the areas most frequented by lobbyists and their political prostitutes, rather than invest in regular, but poor people. At the time of the article's release, Malik was sleeping at a soon-to-close shelter not a mile away from the Capitol, where his voice wouldn't be heard no matter how many times he voted. As Weeks writes, while he is far from certain that extending congressional representation to district and territory residents would solve all the problems we have discussed, he sees it as a necessary start. At least folks in Washington would have a pair of senators and a representative to, quote, bring home the bacon like other states. What else needs to be done, Weeks asks? Big money in politics. From his perspective, it's a problem of poverty and powerlessness going hand in hand. People that got the money, they put their people in government, he says. The poor can't make a move. With that, Malik echoes the thoughts and frustrations of millions, even those that have a vote. And as I mentioned earlier, no, achieving statehood is not the flick-a-switch answer to all of your problems, but it is a step, a required step, the cornerstone of a people's government, the whole fucking concept that this country was founded upon. And that brings me to the next point. To all of you who don't live in the district, to all of you who live in an actual state, and therefore have the right to choose your representatives, your judges, fucking use that power. And yes, I do mean vote. And I know some of you will say, shit, with all of the election fraud that's tarnished just this election alone, I might as well just stay home and cry over a provisional ballot. Here's the thing. Voting is like using your turn signal while driving. It doesn't always make a difference, but someday it will make a difference. And then for fuck's sake, you should be in the habit of doing it. And it really is the least that you could do to be considered a good driver. Same with voting. One of the ultimate goals of all movements is to place the people's voice at the forefront of government, which equals voting. And if you think both duopoly puppets suck, that doesn't mean that you stay home. That means that you get out there and cast your vote for the person who represents the country, but more importantly, the movement that you want to see rising up in this country. The movement that will make our votes count always. The movement that will secure a future that works for everyone, where water isn't fucking poisoned and you don't risk homelessness due to hospital bills. And please don't be afraid to speak your mind outside the two-party lines. That's your fucking right. It's your duty, your job as a citizen to educate yourself and vote for the person who isn't just slightly less shitty, but actually good. Don't let fear dictate your path. And perhaps, even more importantly, keep in mind that 88% of the fucksticks in this house of horror are up for re-election. Those of you in states actually have the ability to pick who sits in those chairs and votes on your behalf. How the fuck could you not grab hold of that? When half a century after civil rights, nearly 10 million voting-age citizens, which includes DC and Puerto Rico residents, felons, and immigrants, are denied the right to vote or voting representation in Congress. When that is the status quo, those of us who can are fucking obligated to cast our vote. And we are all obligated to not only fight for voting rights, but fight against the issues that flow alongside them. Income inequality, the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the sick care system, sexism, racism, a crumbling infrastructure, the poisoning of our kids, our parents, our neighbors, the land, the planet. All of these things are tied together. And all of the solutions to these problems lay on the other side of citizen engagement. You have a voice. Use it. That'll wrap up this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the autumnal Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.